So let's maybe talk a bit. Fabian, can you come back? And then let's discuss a little bit what you've shown, and then also involve the audience with their questions. So maybe I start with Fabian first. So Fabian, I think so. You know, we at Solar Power Europe at Solar Power Europe has been also working on a global market outlook, and you know, there's many others out there, the Bloombergs and so on. So with your forecast, you're somewhat more on the conservative side. If we look back, actually, we've been always way too conservative, even the most optimistic ones. So how do you feel about that? Is there, you must have probably also some high scenario or a low scenario beyond the numbers you've shown, because this is probably the most realistic what you believe. So first, maybe question is why you are somewhat more on the conservative side also this year. I think you still have quite considerable growth, but most of the others are around mid 550 or so for this year. And second, actually, what is there an optimistic scenario? And if yes, what's the number?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. That's something we ask ourselves every day, I think, because when you continue to have two conservative forecasts like we did last year, for example, that was maybe the clearest example when we kind of almost got shocked at the end of the year with all the additions in China that came in December. It was like, oh. So this is something we ask ourselves quite often. And I think the highest numbers I've seen so far is from sort of the serious players are around 600 DC. We think that sounds very high, but like you said, we have like sort of maybe the consensus are around between 500 and 550. And we are, like you said, a bit lower than that, right? So I think what we're always trying to base it on is that we have a bit maybe unique approach to many other companies. We try to track everything bottom up, right? And that maybe only works for the utility side, right? But quite a lot of what we're actually tracking is trying to be reflected in all the projects that are under construction or already operational. So, and as I showed in some of this chart I showed at the beginning, we're not really seeing an explosion of growth this year in terms of utility scale announcements. So, and that's of course kind of a big factor, right? And for example, for our Chinese research stream, since that is so important market, we of course have a lot of discussions with them and try to discuss and have arguments for and against stronger growth. And sort of what it boils down to is the utility scale segment and some of these demand side bottlenecks that we touched on. Like it's a bit more difficult to get the network connections in China this year. It looks like curtailments are on the rise, and also the standard performance from last year is quite extraordinary, and we think will be a bit difficult to replicate. But is it one thing that you have learned after a couple of years in this industry is to never underestimate China, right? So I do think there is a potential upside there, and I will not be very surprised if we see a little bit above 500 gigawatts DC this year. But 600 gigawatts DC, I think it's a bit optimistic. So that's the first part. And on the second part, we do have several scenarios, right? So sort of in the whole company, we have this sort of energy system model, which is not only taking into account solar, and it's typically based around the degrees of scenarios of warming. So we have this base case I mentioned, which is very much sort of bottom up and fundamentals driven. And then we have other scenarios, which is more related to sort of, top down, sort of compliant with a certain degree of warming. And if you are compliant with, let's say, a 1.5 or 1.6 or 1.7 degree of warming scenario, you need much more additions of solars much faster, right? So already in 2 or 3 years, you need 800, 900 gigawatts DC added to the grid each year. And then maybe sort of the conflict there is that if you're trying to actually find where all this will sit, in 900 gigawatts potentially in 2026 is a lot, right? And trying to distribute this across all the markets, we're having some difficulty to see this as a very realistic scenario. But of course, anything can happen in the solar market, and we have been surprised before. But yeah, I think that's connected to why we maybe are a bit conservative this year, and also don't see sort of a 30-40% growth rate globally in the coming years as well.
I was always thinking, so if one should when one looks at solar, one should think the unthinkable a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Look back, but the interesting thing is, I think the Solar Power Europe team did this analysis when looking back at 2023, and actually the forecast for the rest of the world other than China was almost accurate. But the Chinese growth was so inconceivable, huge,
Yes.
that I think this was the point of failure. And I just wonder, I think that's maybe also a bit of a concern that China, not on the supply side, maybe let's talk about later about that, but also on the demand side has become such a huge market. So that means if you look at the rest of the market, the growth was okay, but it was it was sort of in the realm was what you would think. It was simply that they added so much, and the question is rather, now that China is in this economic trouble, and that real estate doesn't work, and they have focused now so much on industrialization, on production, and also on new technologies, solar, batteries, wind, and so on. At the same time, now facing more and more barriers for these products because of energy security concerns in many parts of the world. Is it possible that the government simply say, okay, break fix? So other than what we in Europe probably would never do, because at some point the regulators say, oh my God, the grid is going into the knees, and we cannot even curtail so much, and I think all that waste of money. But in China, they simply would do it, and the batteries are simply built later. So I'm just thinking, so why not just go? Yeah. And so that means that brings me also to this question: is there a stop at 300 gigawatt or 350 gigawatt at some point, or can it grow even larger? And I think that's also true for the rest of the world, but especially China. So that means there's still so much coal, and if you get the flexibility in, and as I understand, they're trying now also. But yeah, so but do you think there is a possibility that at some point simply the government says, let it go, let it roll, and then we go to?
Yeah, I actually do think so. So I think we already saw some signs of it last year with sort of it was already signs of this oversupply situation coming, right? And they needed to boost domestic demand, and I think that was one of the reasons why it was so high additions at the second half of last year. And it's a good question, and I think it could be a realistic scenario. And sort of from an energy system perspective, there's a lot more growth. Just if you just look at sort of the yearly numbers, right? Like solar is still not a large percentage of total generation. And even in our forecast, I just checked during the break, in 2030, we have solar representing 23% of power generation, but 44% of capacity, right? So I think that's maybe where some of these issues are. So of course you can sort of just push all the assets out there, and then it shouldn't be like a limit on 300 or 400 gigawatts DC. But maybe the limit is exactly what you mentioned, right? On sort of all this, the grid connection and the curtailment and this type of things. But they don't really worry about that and focus on that later, and sort of let's just install it. We generate what we can generate, and then we come with the flexibility and the grid later. That's certainly sort of an upside potential, right, for demand in the coming years. So, and yeah, just touching on the first thing you said as well, we had the same thing when we did the look back analysis of last year. I think we hit pretty much spot on for the other markets, but then we did miss it on China. So yeah, and I hope we don't go into that sort of trap again to underestimate China. But you know, it could be. So yeah, let's see what happens.
So when I was at SNEC, so I heard a little bit that the rooftop market is a bit down, but there's still on the utility scale side, despite all these curtailment issues, there's still quite some activity. So that's why we will see growth. But on the rooftop side, because there's of course also a lot of local support involved, at some point they have really these grid issues.
Yeah, and if they're able to boost domestic demand further, it kind of helps in two ways, right? Of course it helps them in the decarbonization targets, which are already surpassing by quite a big margin, but they're also helping out all the domestic players in the country, right? And even if these are, private players, of course, we know how a lot of this there is a lot of collaboration in a sense, and putting the incentives together from the government side to make sure that some of these big companies survive both on the supply side and the demand side. So yeah, I don't think we will see any stop from the incentivization to get these projects online, to put it that way. Yeah.
So I think so. Yeah, I think that's a good point. So that you refer also to the supply side of things. So with all these capacities in China that were built up, and I think we're still seeing factories coming online. And I think here also the government is trying to foster consolidation now, but of course the regional governments have maybe an opposing view because they put also so much money into these factories. So what I understand is sometimes that actually companies might even want to close, but the local governments say, hey, you have to keep things running because we need these jobs and we give you all these free land and so on. So but how do you see this whole consolidation playing out? Because when I look at your production numbers, it's amazing. So we're more or less across the value chain at almost over 1.5 terawatt by end of this year. So on the other hand, you have this low capacity utilization. Still, you anticipate until 2030 the gap being dramatic between supply and demand. So how can that play together? You would think actually that this gap should be closed.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I do think we'll see sort of a closing of the gap. And that chart I made is maybe a bit overly dramatic in a sense, right? Because you said the line on supply, that's the end of the year supply, right? And we also know that there is kind of a lag between the supply and the demand with a year or so, and the utilization cannot be 100% at all. But even if all these three factors are taken into account, you still have quite a big oversupply, right? But on the question of how this can sort of exist and what we will see in the years to come, I wouldn't say that the line chart beyond 2024 is not necessarily a forecast. It's more based on sort of all the announced capacity that is under construction and the big players is saying will come online. So it's sort of more like, okay, if everything the industry is saying that will come online is coming online, this is what will happen, right? And then, of course, we're trying to look at these numbers and treat it a bit more critical. And I think the narrative that we have sort of seen in the media and also the industry knows well about is this: the strongest will survive. It's a useful narrative to consider, right? Like all these big integrated companies, all the Jinkos, the Trinas, the Longi, and the JAs of the world, they will most likely continue to do well, right? They're very large, they're integrated, and they have sort of the scale to survive, right? But on the consolidation side, it's exactly like you said. It's not straightforward in a sense. It's not like you can just absorb all the smaller players because you have the regional factors you mentioned and so on. So I don't think we'll see a close in the supply-demand gap next year, and that will, continue to result in low prices, and then we'll see what happens further down the line. But of course, at some point, we need to have sort of a new equilibrium in the market because this is not sustainable over time, right? That is clear from the chart you showed in the beginning, with all the players either having razor-thin margins or even losses in the first quarter. So it will need to close. I think it will be too soon to see the gap closing next year. But maybe in 2026 we'll see enough sort of capacity either shut down or idle, and a lot of these fabs not being built to maybe have a new balance in the market.
I think the interesting thing is when you talk to the companies at Intersolar, at SNEC, so everyone said, okay, one more year. So
Yeah.
so I think it's a two-year downturn. So I think 1 year is over. To survive that, and then we have another one actually ahead of us. But the question is only, this is also somewhat a little bit of wishful thinking. So first, yeah, again, so the capacities are there, and even if all the PERC is out of the market, okay, we see maybe 400 gigawatt or so vanish, but still, new stuff is coming online. I think people are already now talking about tandem modules with GCL having it, saying that it's very close, and others also saying it's rather a question of 2-3 years than 5 or 6. So I still wonder that in the end, isn't it about actually also getting all technologies out, getting to new technologies to decrease cost, so that we simply adapt more and more towards these prices? Because I wonder if we will see prices go beyond, let's say, 14 cents again or so. Probably not. Or
yeah, exactly. It's a quite simplification to just look at the total demand and the total supply, because it's not taking into sort of the consideration the technology mix you mentioned, right? And I think that's another important thing that is going on right now, to sort of getting the old technology out and getting the new technology in. That's something that we see the industry is taking advantage of in the current situation. So, but yeah, even if this is the case, you know, we don't have an explicit price forecast, but we do think prices will stay quite low next year as well, right? And from the demand side, obviously, is a really good thing, right? You're making solar even more competitive compared to all the technologies, but not so much from the supply side. Yeah.
On the other hand, we see now, of course, this the more world moving apart. And as part of that, energy security takes a bigger play, and solar is now on the radar of policymakers, which it hasn't past. So that means, of course, also that we see also in several regions more and more protectionism. So that means there's free flow of trade is interrupted, which on the other hand also means new capacities. IRA at least has triggered a pipeline of 250 gigawatt or so or more. Let's see what's being built out of that. But again, that's new capacities coming online here. I think you have also a very optimistic view on Europe. I'm not sure, and I believe the European industry would be happy if that would turn out, the manufacturing industry. But how does that? How is this in your model, and what are you seeing there? Because in the end, of course, if you look at your capacities, still, even if new capacities are coming online compared to what the Chinese have, that's marginal, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. So it's exactly this drive that we're seeing in sort of different markets, but for slightly different reasons, right? Like the 3 examples there with Europe, US, and India, they have, you know, quite different market fundamentals. But like you said, for example, I think I saw there was a question in the chat as well, around 60 gigawatts of module production in Europe in 26. I do agree that sounds very, very optimistic. But again, this is maybe sort of a bit sort of uncritical, just taking everything that is in the manufacturing sort of pipeline, right? And we know that all this will not come online, and at the same time, all manufacturing facilities will shut down. So it's not like it will be sort of 60 gigawatts of module manufacturing capacity running at full capacity in Europe in 2026, because that would be close to covering the domestic demand, right? And then for the other markets, I think maybe between Europe and China, there's not that many trade barriers, but there's definitely is the case between US and China, right? So there the push is even stronger, and then finally India is doing it for slightly different reasons again, because they wanna, you know, really start to challenge China. That will take a very long time to do, but they really want to build up the supply chain, and not only on the module side. That was just the first one, but as you saw on the slide there, they want to try to do so across all the steps, and then. My opinion is that it will take some time, and maybe never happen, to be actually cost competitive with the Chinese companies, right? This the sort of the scale advantages and all the other advantages with Chinese manufacturing will be very, very difficult to replicate in other markets. Yeah.
Okay, maybe final question before we move to the policy part. So there was also one question on the US. You see the US market at some point going down before it comes back. Is it already taking into consideration that Trump's becoming the next president, or what's the rationale behind that?
No, it's not. Well, it's implicitly taking it into account, but I think it's more important other drivers there. So, of course, in some sense, as analysts, we have to try to consider all factors, but we're also not geopolitical or political analysts, right? So we try to analyze the market from sort of market fundamentals, and I think this view on the US is at least to somewhat extent supported by the market fundamentals, with some of the arguments I mentioned earlier, with high interest rates that's hurting American developers quite a bit. And even more so than we're seeing in Europe. Like auctions is quite prevalent in Europe, and you can sort of get quite high offtake prices. While in US we see a bit more competitive side on the PPA market, so that's hurting a lot of these developers. And also probably, without being sort of an expert on that, but the grid side is probably even in a worse shape in parts of the US compared to Europe, right? With quite large backlogs when it comes to network upgrades, and also a huge interconnecting queues when it comes to new projects. So I think that is driving the utility market. And on the residential market, which is a bit smaller in the US than in relative to Europe at least, I think for just the example in California is sort of maybe a classic example there, that it's now slowing down quite a bit, and that is sort of a more or less direct result from some of these policy changes that have come in there. So yeah, we're not maybe explicitly taking into account the politics of it, but it's also supported by sort of the market fundamentals with prices and the environment that developers and other consumers are in at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Fabian.
Yeah.
Abdallah, so let's talk a little bit about the policy recommendations. I think it's great that in the global market outlook this year, for the first time, we had some policy recommendations which you contributed, and I think that's really also important now that solar is playing a more important role on the international scene at COP and such events. So I think one of the greatest wins at the recent COP was that the world leaders agreed on renewables need to triple actually, and by 2030. And on the other hand, of course, there's quite some need for financing. And when you talk to developers today, in many areas of the world, it's getting tougher to get financing simply because of the economic situation, high interest rates, all this curtailment, and low capture rates. So I think there's depends of course on the region, but in general it's not such an easy game these days to raise money for renewal projects. So what are you pushing, or how are you pushing the agenda to get more money, more financing for solar?
Thank you, Michael. It is indeed one of the most kind of pressing challenges, and that's why going forward even in COP, COP 29, in New York Climate Week, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on financing. At the Global Solar Council, we're starting our own solar finance working group, where we want to get together all the different stakeholders, or MDPs, intergovernmental organizations, big finances, possibly risk credit agencies, developers, manufacturers, to have a discussion on how we and integrate everyone together. We see there's a lack of, let's say, good integration between the different stakeholders. Some of the MDPs maybe cannot communicate with the developers, which kind of, so you get sometimes mixed messages as well. Some people say like the money is there, but we can't access, developing quicker, or developing of projects is really a big hurdle. So some of the messages we want to, or the kind of the topics we want to address is mitigating risks. that exists in some markets that still needs a lot of development. We're talking about top markets in the US, in the EU, in China, but there's absent regions where there's a lot of potential. We're talking about West Asia, North Africa, even Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of big potential that just needs good project development, and there's a lot of maybe inflated perceived risks for investing in Sub-Saharan Africa. That needs to be one. Of course, there are real risks, but they could be, I would say, inflated. So working on having new ways or better ways to kind of evaluate such risks, and working on that, and guarantees, working on how we can establish strong guarantees, green guarantees for projects, how to ensure there's enough having some more public financing going through, and to incentivize this would work on enhancing these investors' confidence together with the risk mitigation and improving perceived risk ratings. This will overall help in in delivering the solar financing we need, and then also incentivizing new markets. This is what we need, incentivizing new markets that has the potential, so we can also increase some of the demand.
Okay, so maybe let's talk also a bit about permitting, which in some region is really an issue. And I think let's go a little bit beyond just the term of permitting, because it's also about acceptance, and especially which large power plants and involvement, social responsibility. So what is the Global Solar Council doing in this extent? Because I think in some regions, Germany, where I live, for example, there's also best practices, and that means that, for example, developers set up the SPVs where the solar plant is actually also being built, so the locals, municipalities profit from taxes, and that maybe even some of the revenues is being shared with the owners, and then you make sure, of course, that biodiversity aspects are taken into consideration, so that you not just have blue or black solar fields. So is the Global Solar Council working on such aspects? Because I think this not in my backyard opposition we will see more and more, right?
Yes, it is true. And then not just people's perception sometimes is a bit, I don't know, call it foggy on what do they think of solar. Sometimes the wind has that more of not in my backyard attitude, and some people would say also, like, don't build any solar or wind anywhere, nowhere, because we don't want this technology, and there's a lot of misconceptions going on. So we first trying to tackle the misconceptions and disinformation that is going on out there, regarding your energy payback or the emissions payback of solar panels, costs related to them, and perceived environmental risks. And I mean, we don't say that solar is a perfect solution with no like real impacts. It does have impacts. It has its weaknesses. We're working on it. We need to work on that, because this is a needed technology for the energy transition. But a lot of things are taken out of disproportion. So working communication a lot is really important. So just to tackle the point of view, just to tackle these mixed messages we see out there. And another important part for that is how to include people and include locals in solar deployment. And this is, of course, where distributed solar comes in. And I like your example, Germany, you have solar balconies, like there's a regulation for installing solar in your balcony, or plug-in solar. There's a lot of different regulation and incentives you can give to make people participate, to lower their electricity bills. And when that happens, when they perceive the benefits for themselves. This perceives, local support for PV, and this, kind of carries a wave of planning more for PV, and municipalities encourage that even more, because it's a one benefit you can have for your people. So definitely working more on distributed solar, not just in technology, but distributing the benefits for everyone, for the farmers, for the residentials, for like people to have enhanced energy access in general. And then in permitting, it could be technical, and we need to make sure that solar doesn't have a big environmental impact. So that's why, some permitting comes in with its own environmental impact assessments, which is crucial. But what's important is that we see what the size of solar, what type of project of solar is being implemented, and according to type of project, place of project, you need to have dynamic permitting time structure that kind of makes permitting much more smoother overall.
Okay, maybe I think we're already 5 minutes over. Final question to both of you. So, so what do you think is the most important fix needed policy-wise to get the market going in the next 1.5 years so that growth can maybe continue beyond what you're forecasting, Fabian?
I think sort of what our view is that is the supply chain is delivering, right? So I think maybe that's where not we should focus at the moment, but really focus on some of this demand bottlenecks, right? And maybe one of the things that can be focused on is, for example, the use of auctions, right? So I'm usually normally covering European markets, and we're seeing that is quite successful. And is being replicated in many other markets as well. So I think that's a really good option, but that is still not addressing the sort of, it's maybe addressing the surface issue, but not sort of the deeper problems of network constraints and so on. And they are maybe a bit more technical in nature, but ultimately they need sort of the policy to start, right? For example, the funding of grid, like how that's being done, that's probably very different country to country, but also just tackling sort of the mismatch between the development timeline of a solar project, which is maybe 2-3 years, and then the grid projects, which, well, I'm in Norway and everything takes a lot of time here, but it takes 10 years, right, to build sort of a high voltage line. And I think that's representative of many other countries as well. So I think that's maybe one key thing to address, right? Flexibility in terms of grid, and also enabling storage, right? And just the continued cost reduction of storage will be important. But we're still not there yet in most markets across the world, where, for example, a battery with 4-hour storage and a solar farm can compete with a gas plant, for example. So I think those 3 things are maybe what I could think of on the top of my head. Enable use auctions or other schemes, really fast track grid developments, and finally also look at other flexibility like batteries and how we can sort of bridge the gap on the cost until batteries are truly cost competitive. Yeah.
Okay, super. Thanks, Fabian. Abdallah, final words.
Yes, I agree in Fabian. There's, we need to avoid bottlenecks, and these bottlenecks, they are very crucial to the continuous sustainability of markets around the world, which could be hindered by introducing trade defense measures, taxes on models, on other components. This could be really problematic for the sustainable growth of the market, because if we reach a bottleneck, if we choke a market, it's going to be really hard to kind of get back on the momentum. And on that note, we need a lot of global dialogue. We need cooperation instead of markets working in silos. And this cooperation it could be in cooperation on trade, cooperation on technologies, and on grids and interconnections, and enabling new markets. Even we need to look into where there's new and emerging markets that needs to be enabled by different mechanisms. And lastly, I would say we need to think long term. So we need, now in the next couple of years, we need long-term planning. We just need to stop thinking, in 1 decade or 5 years. We need a plan for in 2050, 2070, we need to plan for 100% renewable energy in our grids. And when we start thinking about that, we stop thinking about incremental changes of renewables and how to accommodate that. And then we start thinking of how a new system should be engineering new grids, a new system that is designed for renewable energy. And then we kind of go from there.
Okay, thanks. That's great. I think still quite some challenges ahead of us. Nevertheless, growth is also ahead of us. The question is only how much. Thanks a lot for your great contributions. So who's still with us? Just a few more information from our side. Udaya, can you just share? Thanks again to JA, but we have these are the 3 latest reports we just published. Recently we published our first market survey on floating. Fabian mentioned that this is coming. And bifacial solar systems we also recently published. And during Intersolar we published our top solar modules report, where we look at the most efficient modules. Next week we will publish our annual market survey on trackers. Then upcoming event. So we've also a long history in production equipment and technology. So what we've done now, we've teamed up with EUPD and RE+, and at RE+, the largest event in the US in Anaheim taking place beginning of September, we will have a physical event where we try to gather all stakeholders in manufacturing and trying to set up factories in the US from wafers, cells to modules and also materials. So if you're around in the US, you're invited to join us. We have already quite a nice lineup of speakers. If you're also interested, just get in touch with me. Hope to see you there. But before September, we also have one of our online events, and here, end of the month, we will simply look back at SNEC and Intersolar, but purely on taking the technology glasses on. We will simply have leading companies provide the latest news on what they exhibited during these 2 exhibitions. That's it from our side. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to everyone, our sponsors, our presenters, the team, and last but not least, you, the audience, listening to us and contributing with your comments. Thanks a lot and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael, Fabian.